In the winter of 1847, when the Kansas Territory was still a wild frontier where survival meant fighting nature every single day, a woman's desperate cries echoed through a howling blizzard that would become legendary among the settlers. Margaret O'Sullivan clutched two tiny bundles against her chest, her husband's blood still fresh on the cabin floor behind her, as the wind outside promised nothing but death. What happened next would challenge everything people believed about enemies and allies, about the color of skin and the content of character. It would prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, wearing the face of those we've been taught to fear. This is not just a story about survival. It's about the moment when two worlds collided in a snowstorm, and how a Comanche warrior's single decision would echo through generations, changing the course of 3 lives forever. The blizzard was merciless. The babies were dying, and time was running out. But sometimes, just sometimes, the wilderness sends an angel disguised as the enemy. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face against the frost-covered window of their small cabin, watching her husband Thomas disappear into the gray morning mist. The Kansas Territory stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of brown grass and scattered trees that seemed to swallow men whole. She touched her still tender belly, feeling the absence of the twins who had arrived just 3 weeks ago, now sleeping peacefully in their wooden cradle by the fire. "Be careful out there," she whispered to the empty landscape, though her words fogged the glass and obscured her view even more. The cattle had wandered off again during the night, probably spooked by wolves or maybe something worse. Thomas had taken his rifle and enough supplies for 2 days, confident he could track them down and bring them home before the weather turned. But Margaret had learned to read the sky during their 2 years on the frontier, and today it looked angry. The clouds hung low and heavy, pregnant with snow that would come whether they were ready or not. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to tend the fire, pushing away the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The twins stirred in their cradle, 2 perfect little faces that looked exactly like Thomas, with their dark hair and serious expressions. Baby Joseph opened his eyes first, followed immediately by little William, as if they were connected by some invisible thread that made them move in harmony. Margaret lifted them both, one in each arm, and settled into the rocking chair Thomas had carved for her birthday. "Your daddy will be back soon," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring them or herself.
"He's just gone to fetch our stubborn cows, and then we'll all be together again."
The morning passed slowly, marked only by the twins' feeding schedule and the steady sound of wind picking up outside. Margaret tried to keep busy, mending Thomas's torn shirt and preparing a stew for his return, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The grey sky had darkened to an ominous purple, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. By afternoon, the snowflakes had turned into a steady curtain of white that made it impossible to see beyond their small porch. Margaret paced the cabin with both babies, singing softly to keep them calm, while her own heart raced with worry. Thomas should have been back by now. He had promised to return before dark, and he never broke his promises. The wind grew stronger as evening approached, howling around their cabin like a living thing trying to find a way inside. Margaret checked the window latches and made sure the door was securely barred, then built up the fire until it roared in the stone hearth. The twins seemed to sense her anxiety and fussed more than usual, their tiny cries adding to the symphony of the storm outside. Night fell like a curtain, bringing with it the full fury of the blizzard. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that climbed higher by the hour, and the wind shook the cabin so violently that Margaret feared the roof might give way. She wrapped the babies in every blanket she could find, and huddled with them near the fire, singing lullabies and telling them stories about their father's bravery. "He's probably found shelter somewhere," she told them, though her voice shook with doubt. "Maybe in that old line shack near Devil's Creek, or under some rocky overhang. He's smart, your daddy is. He knows how to survive out there." But as the hours dragged on and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Margaret began to face the terrible truth she had been trying to avoid. Thomas was caught somewhere in this blizzard, possibly injured, possibly worse. Possibly worse. And she was alone with 2 newborn babies trapped in a cabin that felt smaller with each passing hour. The fire began to die down despite her efforts to feed it, and Margaret realized with growing horror that their wood supply was running dangerously low. Thomas had planned to chop more before winter set in earnest, but the babies had come early and there had been no time. She looked at the dwindling pile of logs in the corner and calculated that she might have enough fuel to last through the night, but certainly not much longer. She bundled the twins carefully and ventured onto the porch to gather what little wood remained in the outdoor pile. but the wind nearly knocked her down and the snow was so thick she could barely breathe. The logs were buried under 3 feet of snow and frozen solid to the ground. She managed to retrieve only 2 small pieces before retreating back inside, her hands so numb she could barely feel the door latch. The twins were crying when she returned, their small faces red with cold and hunger. Margaret fed them again, using up more of her body's reserves that she wasn't sure she could spare. She hadn't eaten since morning, too worried about Thomas to have much appetite, and now she wondered if she should have forced herself to eat more. The babies depended on her milk, and if she weakened, they would weaken too. As the night wore on, the cabin grew colder despite the fire. Frost began to form on the inside of the windows, and Margaret could see her breath in small puffs when she exhaled. She pulled the babies closer to her body, using her own warmth to keep them alive, and tried not to think about what would happen when the fire went out completely. The storm raged through the night with unrelenting fury, and by morning Margaret knew that Thomas was not coming home. The snow had drifted so high against the door that she couldn't have opened it even if she had wanted to. They were trapped, truly trapped, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that help would even come looking. She looked down at Joseph and William, sleeping peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of their desperate situation. They trusted her completely, depending on her for everything, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than the snow piling up outside. She was 19 years old, alone in the wilderness with 2 babies and a dying fire, and she had no idea how to save them all. The second day brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind seemed to blow even harder, and the temperature continued to drop until Margaret could feel the cold seeping through the walls of the cabin. She burned her last piece of furniture, the wooden stool Thomas had made when they first arrived, and watched the flames consume it far too quickly. By the third day, Margaret was weak from hunger and exhaustion. The babies cried constantly now, sensing her distress and frustrated by her diminishing milk supply. She had eaten nothing but a handful of dried beans and some stale bread, saving what little food they had in case the storm lasted even longer. The fire died on the morning of the 4th day, leaving them in a cabin that felt as cold as a tomb. Margaret wrapped the babies in every piece of clothing and bedding she could find, creating a nest of fabric that she hoped would hold their body heat. She climbed in with them, pulling her husband's heavy coat over all 3 of them, and tried to stay awake long enough to keep them warm. But exhaustion was winning the battle against her will to survive. Her eyelids grew heavy, and her body ached with cold and hunger. The babies had stopped crying, which frightened her more than their earlier fussing. She knew that silence often meant they were shutting down, their tiny bodies conserving energy for basic survival functions. "I'm sorry," she whispered to them, her voice barely audible in the frozen air. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. Your daddy would have known what to do. He would have found a way." Margaret closed her eyes and felt herself drifting toward unconsciousness, her body finally surrendering to the cold and fatigue that had been building for days. She had fought as hard as she could, but sometimes fighting wasn't enough. Sometimes the wilderness won, despite all the courage and determination in the world. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the sound of something moving outside the cabin, something large and deliberate that didn't match the random chaos of the storm. But she was too far gone to care, too tired to be afraid, too weak to wonder if salvation or death was coming to call. Running Wolf had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 days when the blizzard struck with the fury of angry spirits. As a hunter for his Comanche band, he had seen many storms sweep across the plains, but this one carried the promise of death in its howling voice. The elk's trail had vanished under the mounting snow, and even his experienced eyes could no longer distinguish the landscape he had known since childhood. He pulled his buffalo hide cloak tighter against his lean frame and urged his paint horse forward, searching for any kind of shelter that could protect them both from the storm's wrath. The horse snorted and shook its mane, ice crystals forming around its nostrils as it struggled through the deepening drifts. Running Wolf knew they needed to find refuge soon, or neither of them would see another sunrise. The wind carried strange scents through the swirling snow, smells that didn't belong to the natural world of the prairie. Wood smoke, though old and fading. Something else too, something human but unfamiliar. Running Wolf had learned long ago to trust his senses above all else, and now they were telling him that people were nearby, probably suffering in this storm just as he was. He guided his horse toward the source of the scents, moving carefully through the white chaos that had swallowed the world. The snow was nearly up to his horse's chest now, making every step a struggle, but Running Wolf persisted. His father had taught him that survival often depended on making choices that seemed foolish to others, and helping strangers during a deadly storm certainly qualified as foolish. But the Comanche way taught that all life was connected, that the spirits watched how a man treated others when death was near. Running Wolf had taken many lives in battle and in the hunt, but he had also saved lives when the opportunity arose. It was the balance that kept his spirit clean and his path clear. Through the driving snow, he glimpsed a dark shape that didn't match the natural contours of the landscape. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a small log cabin, nearly buried under massive drifts of snow. No smoke rose from its chimney, and no light showed through its frost-covered windows. To most people, it would have looked abandoned, but Running Wolf could still detect the faint traces of recent human presence. He dismounted and led his horse to the lee side of the cabin, where the wind was slightly less brutal. The pain horse immediately turned its rump to the storm and lowered its head, instinctively knowing to conserve energy. Running Wolf approached the cabin on foot, his moccasins making no sound in the deep snow. The front door was completely blocked by a drift that reached nearly to the roof, but Running Wolf noticed that the snow on this side was slightly disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig out recently. He began clearing away the snow with his hands, working methodically despite the cold that bit through his skin like tiny teeth. After what felt like hours of digging, he managed to clear enough space to reach the wooden door. He pressed his ear against it and heard something that made his blood run cold. The weak, muffled crying of babies, so faint it was almost lost in the storm's roar. But Running Wolf's ears were trained to catch the smallest sounds, and he knew the difference between the wind's voice and a human child's distress. He tried the door latch and found it barred from the inside. The crying continued, weaker now, and Running Wolf realized that time was running out for whoever was trapped inside. He moved around to the back of the cabin, looking for another way in, and found a small window that was partially clear of snow. Using the butt of his tomahawk, he carefully broke the glass and cleared away the fragments. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but Running Wolf was lean and flexible from years of hunting and warfare. He squeezed through the window and dropped silently into the frozen interior of the cabin. The cold inside the cabin was almost as bitter as the storm outside, and Running Wolf could see his breath in thick clouds as he looked around. The remains of a fire lay dead in the stone hearth, and frost covered every surface like a coating of death. In the corner, wrapped in a pile of blankets and clothing, he saw the source of the crying. A young white woman lay unconscious, clutching two tiny babies against her chest. Her lips were blue with cold, and her breathing was so shallow that Running Wolf had to watch carefully to see her chest rise and fall. The babies were barely moving, their cries now just weak mewling sounds that spoke of imminent death. Running Wolf had expected to find a white settler family, but seeing them like this, helpless and dying, stirred something unexpected in his chest. These were not the gun-carrying soldiers who had burned his uncle's village 2 winters ago, or the buffalo hunters who slaughtered the great herds and left the meat to rot. These were just a woman and her children, as vulnerable as any Comanche mother, and babies caught in a blizzard. He moved quickly to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. There was very little wood left, just a few scraps and some broken furniture, but it would have to do. He used his flint and steel to spark the tinder, blowing gently until the flames caught and began to spread. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls and brought the first warmth the space had felt in days. Running Wolf stripped off his buffalo hide cloak and spread it over the women and babies, then began gathering anything that would burn. A wooden chair, some old newspapers, even the pages from a book that lay open on a small table. He fed the flames carefully, knowing he had to make the fuel last. As warmth began to fill the cabin, the woman stirred slightly and opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked at Running Wolf without comprehension, her mind too fogged by cold and exhaustion to process what she was seeing. Then her eyes focused on his painted face and long black hair, and he saw fear replace confusion in her gaze. She tried to pull away from him, clutching the babies tighter, but she was too weak to move more than a few inches. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Running Wolf held up his hands, palms out, in the universal gesture of peace, and spoke to her in the few English words he had learned from captured traders. "No hurt," he said carefully, his accent making the words sound strange even to his own ears. "Help babies. Help you." The woman stared at him with wide eyes, clearly struggling to understand what was happening. Here was a Comanche warrior, painted for war and armed with weapons. But instead of attacking her, he was building up the fire and speaking words of help. It went against everything she had been told about his people, everything she had been taught to fear. Running Wolf saw her confusion and continued speaking, mixing English words with Comanche and using hand gestures to communicate his intentions. He pointed to the babies, then to himself, then made motions of feeding and warming. The woman's fear began to mix with desperate hope as she realized that he meant no harm. One of the babies, the smaller one, had stopped moving entirely. Running Wolf gently took the child from the woman's arms, ignoring her weak protests, and held the tiny body close to the fire. The baby's skin was pale and cold, its breathing almost imperceptible. Running Wolf had seen this before in Comanche children caught in sudden storms, and he knew what needed to be done. He opened his own shirt and pressed the baby against his bare chest, using his body heat to warm the child's core temperature. The woman watched in amazement as this fierce-looking warrior cradled her son with the gentleness of an experienced father. Slowly, gradually, the baby's color began to improve and its breathing became stronger. The second baby was in better condition, but still dangerously cold. Running Wolf repeated the process, warming the child against his body while the fire grew stronger and began to heat the cabin properly. The woman tried to speak, to thank him or ask him questions, but her voice was too weak and her throat too raw from the cold. Instead, she watched as Running Wolf worked tirelessly to save her children's lives. He melted snow in a pot over the fire to provide them with water, and he found a few strips of dried meat in his traveling pack that he softened in the warm water to make a nutritious broth. When the woman was strong enough to sit up, he helped her drink the broth and eat some of the meat. As the hours passed and warmth returned to the cabin, the woman began to recover her strength. She was able to nurse the babies again, though her milk supply was limited by her own poor condition. Running Wolf found a few potatoes stored in a root cellar beneath the cabin floor and roasted them in the coals, sharing them with her to help rebuild her energy. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, 3 lives had been saved from the jaws of death. Running Wolf sat by the fire, feeding it carefully and watching over his unexpected charges. He knew that his own band would be worried about him, wondering if he had survived the blizzard, but he also knew he couldn't leave these people until the storm passed, and they were strong enough to survive on their own. The woman finally found her voice as the cabin grew warm, and her fear began to subside. "My name is Margaret," she said softly, looking at Running Wolf with eyes that still held traces of amazement. "These are my boys, Joseph and William. My husband Thomas, he went to find our cattle before the storm. He hasn't come back." Running Wolf nodded, understanding more from her tone and expression than from her words. He had seen the signs around the cabin, the preparations for winter that had been interrupted, the single set of tracks leading away into the storm that had been covered by snow days ago. The woman's husband was almost certainly dead, frozen somewhere on the prairie, but Running Wolf would not add to her grief by confirming what she already suspected in her heart. Instead, he pointed to himself and said, "Running Wolf." Then he pointed outside and made gestures indicating the storm, followed by motions of waiting and staying. Margaret understood that he was telling her he would stay until the blizzard passed, and she felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This Comanche warrior, who should have been her enemy, had become the answer to prayers she hadn't even realized she was praying. He had saved not just her life but the lives of her children, and he was asking for nothing in return except the chance to help them survive. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, and during that time, Margaret O'Sullivan discovered that everything she thought she knew about Comanche warriors was wrong. Running Wolf moved through her cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions, but his every action was guided by an unexpected gentleness. He seemed to understand babies instinctively, perhaps because he had children of his own somewhere out on the vast prairie. When Joseph cried in the night, Running Wolf would lift him from Margaret's arms and walk slowly around the cabin, humming a low Comanche lullaby that seemed to calm the infant immediately. When William fussed during feeding, Running Wolf would stroke the baby's tiny head with one finger, his touch so light it was barely perceptible. Margaret watched these interactions with wonder and growing trust. She'd been raised on stories of Comanche savagery, tales of raids and kidnappings that had filled her nightmares since childhood. But here was a man who could have easily killed her and taken whatever supplies he wanted, instead choosing to share his food and risk his own safety to keep her fire burning through the storm. On the second day of their strange partnership, Margaret's milk supply began to fail entirely. The stress and poor nutrition of the past week had taken their toll, and despite her desperate efforts, she could barely produce enough nourishment for one baby, let alone 2. Joseph and William began crying constantly, their small faces red with hunger and frustration. Running Wolf observed the situation with the keen eyes of someone who had seen death approach many times before. He understood what was happening even without sharing Margaret's language, and he knew that without intervention, at least one of the babies would not survive. He had seen it happen in his own tribe during harsh winters, when food was scarce and mothers' bodies could no longer sustain their children. He disappeared outside into the howling storm, Returning an hour later covered with snow and carrying something wrapped in hide, Margaret watched nervously as he unwrapped his bundle, revealing several strips of what looked like leather, but smelled faintly sweet. Running Wolf held up one of the strips and made eating motions, then pointed to the babies. "What is that?" Margaret asked, though she suspected he couldn't understand her complex question. Running Wolf seemed to search for English words, then said carefully, "Baby food." "Good." He pointed to his chest, then to the babies, trying to communicate that this was something his people used to feed infants when mothers couldn't nurse. The strips were actually prepared buffalo hide that had been processed with prairie turnip and other nutrients, creating a kind of emergency baby food that Comanche mothers had used for generations. Running Wolf showed Margaret how to soften small pieces in warm water until they formed a nutritious paste that could be fed to the babies with a finger. At first, Margaret was hesitant to feed her children something so foreign, but their desperate crying convinced her to try. To her amazement, both Joseph and William took to the new food immediately, sucking eagerly at her finger, and finally settling into peaceful sleep afterward. For the first time in days, the cabin was quiet except for the storm outside. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing roasted potatoes, Margaret found herself really looking at Running Wolf for the first time. Beneath the paint and the fierce exterior, she saw a man, probably close to her own age, with intelligent eyes and careful hands. When he thought she wasn't watching, his expression grew soft and distant, and she wondered if he was thinking about his own family, his own children who might be worried about him. She began trying to communicate with him more directly, using simple words and gestures to ask about his life. Through a combination of broken English, hand signals, and drawings made in the ash near the fire, she learned that he had a wife and 2 children of his own, a boy and a girl. His band was camped several days' ride to the west, probably weathering the storm in their traditional winter lodge. When Margaret showed him her wedding ring and pointed to herself, then gestured questioningly toward the door where Thomas had disappeared, Running Wolf's face grew somber. He shook his head slowly and made a gesture that needed no translation. He was telling her, as gently as he could, that her husband was not coming back. The knowledge that she had been avoiding for days finally settled in her heart like a stone. Thomas was dead, frozen somewhere out on the prairie while trying to save their cattle. She was alone now, truly alone, with 2 babies and winter just beginning. The reality of her situation hit her with devastating force, and she began to cry, quietly at first, then with deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Running Wolf watched her grief with respectful silence, understanding that some pain needed to be expressed before healing could begin. When her tears finally subsided, he moved closer and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could to a stranger whose world had just collapsed. The next day brought the first break in the storm's fury. The wind died down to a whisper, and pale sunlight filtered through the clouds for the first time in nearly a week. Running Wolf ventured outside to check on his horse and assess the situation, returning with news that the worst had passed. But even as the storm cleared, new problems emerged. The cabin's wood supply was completely exhausted, and Margaret had no idea how to cut down trees or split logs for fuel. The food situation was equally dire, with only a few pounds of flour and some dried vegetables remaining from Thomas's carefully planned winter stores. Running Wolf understood the gravity of their situation better than Margaret did. He had lived through many harsh winters, and he knew that this was only the beginning of the cold season. Without adequate fuel and food supplies, Margaret and her babies would not survive until spring, no matter how much courage and determination they possessed. He spent that day digging through the snow around the cabin, searching for anything useful that might have been buried by the storm. He found Thomas's axe in the woodshed and began cutting down dead branches from nearby trees, working with the efficiency of long practice. Margaret watched from the window as he split the wood into manageable pieces and stacked them near the cabin door. When he came inside that evening, Running Wolf attempted to explain something important to Margaret. Using gestures and the few English words he knew, he tried to tell her that he needed to leave soon to find his own people, but that she couldn't survive alone. The conversation was frustrating for both of them, full of misunderstandings and incomplete thoughts, but gradually his meaning became clear. He was offering to take her and the babies with him. Margaret's first reaction was shock, then fear. Go with him to a Comanche camp? Live among people who had been portrayed as her natural enemies? It seemed impossible, dangerous, perhaps even insane. But as she looked around the cold cabin, at her dwindling supplies and her helpless babies, she began to understand that she might not have any other choice. Running Wolf seemed to sense her confusion and fear. He spent the next hour trying to reassure her, using every method of communication he could think of, to explain that she and her children would be safe among his people. He drew pictures in the ash showing lodges and families, children playing and women working together. He pointed to himself, then to her, and the babies, then made protective gestures that clearly indicated his promise to keep them safe. But Margaret couldn't make such a momentous decision quickly. The very idea of leaving everything she knew and understood, of trusting her life and her children's lives to people she had been taught to fear, required a leap of faith that seemed almost impossible to make. That night, as Running Wolf slept by the fire and the babies dozed peacefully in their makeshift cradle, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to think of alternatives. She could wait for rescue, but who would come looking for her? Her nearest neighbors were 20 miles away, and they'd probably assumed she and Thomas had either fled the storm or perished in it. She could try to make it to town on her own, but the journey was over 50 miles through wilderness, impossible with 2 infants and no transportation. The more she considered her options, the more she realized that Running Wolf's offer might be her only real chance for survival. He had already saved her life once and shown nothing but kindness and protection toward her children. If he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so easily at any time during their days together. As dawn broke clear and cold over the snow-covered prairie, Margaret made the decision that would change the course of her entire life. She woke Running Wolf and, using gestures and simple words, told him that she would go with him to find his people. Running Wolf's face broke into the first real smile she had seen from him, and he nodded with obvious relief. He had been genuinely worried about leaving her alone to die, and her agreement to come with him solved a problem that had been weighing heavily on his mind. They spent that day preparing for the journey. Running Wolf fashioned a travelway from branches and buffalo hide, creating a secure shelter where Margaret could ride with the babies protected from the wind and cold. He packed everything useful from the cabin, including Thomas's rifle and ammunition, understanding that these items might be valuable for trade or necessary for protection during their travels. As Margaret took one last look around the cabin where she had been so happy with Thomas, where her children had been born, where her old life had ended and her new one was about to begin, she felt a mixture of grief and hope that was almost overwhelming. She was leaving behind everything familiar and safe, venturing into an unknown world with a man she had known for less than a week. But as she watched Running Wolf carefully secure the babies in their traveling shelter, checking every knot and adjustment to ensure their safety, she knew she was making the right choice. This Comanche warrior had already proven himself to be more trustworthy and caring than many of the white men she had known. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges and dangers they might face, she believed that he would keep his promise to protect her and her children. The journey to find his people would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine, but Margaret had already learned the most important lesson of her new life. Sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the greatest courage lies in learning to trust someone completely different from yourself. The journey across the frozen prairie tested every assumption Margaret had ever held about survival, trust, and the boundaries between different worlds. Running Wolf moved across the landscape with a confidence that spoke of generations of inherited knowledge. Reading signs in the snow and wind that were invisible to her untrained eyes, the travelways he had constructed proved to be a marvel of practical engineering. The babies rode secure and warm in their shelter of buffalo hide and trade blankets, protected from the bitter wind that cut across the open grassland like a knife. Margaret huddled beside them, marveling at how comfortable the conveyance was, compared to the rough wooden wagon that had brought her and Thomas to their homestead 2 years ago. Running Wolf's paint horse pulled the travois with steady determination, its breath forming clouds of steam in the frigid air. The warrior himself walked alongside, leading the horse and constantly scanning the horizon for dangers or landmarks that would guide them home. He seemed tireless, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life in harmony with this harsh environment. On their second day of travel, they encountered their first real test. Margaret woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find Running Wolf standing motionless beside their small camp, his body tense with alertness. She followed his gaze and saw shapes moving in the distance too far away to identify, but clearly heading in their direction. Running Wolf made quick hand signals for her to remain quiet and still, then moved to his horse and began preparing his weapons. Margaret felt her heart racing as she realized they might be about to face the kind of danger she had always feared on the frontier. But as the shapes grew closer, Running Wolf's posture relaxed, and he made sounds that seemed to be some kind of signal. The approaching figures revealed themselves to be 3 Comanche warriors from Running Wolf's own band, out searching for him after the blizzard. Margaret watched with fascination and growing relief as Running Wolf greeted them in their own language, clearly explaining the situation and introducing her as someone under his protection. The three warriors examined Margaret and her babies with curious but not unfriendly eyes. One of them, an older man with graying hair and numerous scars, spoke to Running Wolf at length, occasionally gesturing toward Margaret. She couldn't understand the words, but she could sense that some kind of discussion or negotiation was taking place. Running Wolf turned to her and attempted to explain, using the mixture of English words and gestures that had become their primary means of communication. The older warrior was his uncle, Grey Bear, and he was questioning the wisdom of bringing white settlers to their winter camp, not because of hostility, but because of practical concerns about food, shelter, and the reactions of other band members. Through patient translation, Margaret learned that her presence would need to be approved by the band's chief, and that there were customs and protocols she would need to understand if she wanted to be accepted into their community, even temporarily. The concept of being judged and possibly rejected by people she had never met was terrifying, but she knew she had no other options. The warriors decided to escort them for the remainder of the journey, both as honor guard for Running Wolf and as protection for the unusual group he was bringing home. Margaret found herself riding in the center of a small procession, surrounded by men who represented everything her previous life had taught her to fear, yet who were treating her with careful respect and consideration. As they traveled together, Margaret began to observe the subtle dynamics within the group. Grey Bear was clearly the senior member, his opinions carrying great weight even though he wasn't technically in command. The younger warriors deferred to both him and Running Wolf, but she could see them stealing curious glances at her and whispering among themselves about this unprecedented situation. On the third day, they crested a low hill, and Margaret saw her first Comanche winter camp. The sight took her breath away, not because of its primitive appearance as she had expected, but because of its obvious organization and prosperity. Dozens of buffalo hide lodges were arranged in careful patterns, with smoke rising from cooking fires and children playing in the snow between the structures. The camp was larger than the town where she and Thomas had bought their supplies, and it bustled with activity despite the harsh weather. Women moved between the lodges carrying water and fuel. Men worked on weapons and tools, and children played elaborate games that seemed to involve the entire community. It looked, she realized with surprise, like a thriving town rather than the savage wilderness settlement she had imagined. As their small procession approached the camp, people began emerging from their lodges to see what was happening. Margaret felt dozens of eyes upon her, studying her pale skin and foreign clothing, examining the babies she held so protectively in her arms. The attention was overwhelming, but she forced herself to sit straight and meet their gazes with as much dignity as she could muster. Running Wolf led them directly to the center of the camp, where the largest lodge stood decorated with painted symbols and hung with medicine bundles. Margaret understood instinctively that this was the chief's home, the seat of authority in this mobile community. Her heart pounded as she realized that her fate and her children's fate would be decided by whatever happened in the next few minutes. An elderly man emerged from the chief's lodge, his presence immediately commanding respect from everyone present. His hair was white, but his posture was straight and strong, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions for his people. This was clearly the chief, the man whose word would determine whether she lived or died. Running Wolf dismounted and approached the chief with formal gestures of respect. A long conversation followed, conducted entirely in Comanche, but accompanied by expressive hand signals that allowed Margaret to follow some of the discussion. Running Wolf was explaining how he had found her, why he had chosen to help her, and what he was asking the chief to allow. Other band members gathered around, drawn by curiosity and the obvious importance of what was happening. Margaret saw women pointing at her babies and speaking in concerned tones, and she realized they were discussing the practical implications of adding 3 more mouths to feed during the difficult winter months. The chief approached Margaret directly, his weathered face serious but not unkind. He spoke to her in careful English, his accent heavy but his words clear enough to understand. "Woman, your man is dead," he said without preamble. "Running Wolf tells me you have no people, no home, no way to live through winter. Is this true?" Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at hearing Thomas's death spoken so plainly, but she nodded and managed to respond. "Yes, that's true. My husband went to find our cattle and never came back. Running Wolf saved me and my babies from freezing to death." The chief studied her for a long moment, then looked down at Joseph and William, who were sleeping peacefully despite all the commotion around them. His expression softened slightly as he observed their tiny faces, and Margaret sensed that he was weighing not just practical concerns but moral obligations as well. Running Wolf asks me to let you stay with us until spring comes, the chief continued. He says you are good woman, that you have brave heart, but we are not your people. Our ways are not your ways. Why should we share our food with strangers when winter is hard for everyone? The question was fair, and Margaret knew that her answer could determine whether her children lived or died. She thought of everything she had learned about Running Wolf during their days together, his kindness and honor, his obvious love for his own family, his willingness to risk his life for strangers. Because, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction, your warrior Running Wolf has shown me that good hearts exist in all people, no matter what they look like or where they come from. I don't ask for charity. I'll work for my place here. I'll do whatever needs to be done to earn the food my children eat and the shelter that keeps us warm. And if you give us this chance, I promise that we'll never forget your kindness. The chief listened to her words, then turned to consult with several other older band members who had gathered nearby. Margaret couldn't understand their discussion, but she could see that opinion was divided. Some seemed to support Running Wolf's request, while others appeared to have concerns about the precedent of accepting white refugees. The debate continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence and turned back to Margaret. His decision, she knew, would echo through the rest of her life and determine what kind of future her children would have. You may stay, he said simply. But you must understand our laws and respect our ways. You will live in the lodge of Running Wolf's family, and his wife will teach you what you need to know. If you cause trouble or refuse to work, you will be asked to leave. If you prove yourself worthy, you will be welcomed as one of us for as long as you choose to remain. Margaret felt overwhelming relief wash over her. So strong it nearly brought her to her knees. She managed to thank the chief in her limited vocabulary, then looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some showed curiosity, others concern, but none showed the hatred or hostility she had expected. These people were giving her a chance, offering her a place in their community based solely on Running Wolf's word and her own promise to contribute. Running Wolf led her toward a large lodge painted with symbols of horses and buffalo. As they walked, children ran alongside them, chattering excitedly in their own language and stealing glimpses of the babies. Margaret realized that her presence was probably the most interesting thing that had happened in the camp for months, and that she would be the subject of countless conversations around evening fires. A woman emerged from the painted lodge, and Margaret knew immediately that this must be Running Wolf's wife. She was beautiful in a strong, practical way, with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke of constant, useful work. Her expression was carefully neutral as she examined Margaret and the babies, but there was no hostility in her gaze. Running Wolf spoke to his wife at length, explaining the situation, and obviously asking for her cooperation in the arrangement. The woman listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions or making observations that seemed to carry great weight with her husband. Finally, she nodded and approached Margaret directly. I am Singing Bird, she said in careful English that was much better than Running Wolf's. These are my children. She gestured to two youngsters who had been hiding behind her skirt, a boy of about 6 and a girl perhaps 4 years old. You will share our lodge and our food. In return, you will help with work and learn our ways. Do you agree? Margaret nodded eagerly, grateful beyond words for this woman's willingness to open her home to strangers. Yes, I agree. Thank you for your kindness. I'll do everything I can to help and learn. Singing Bird studied her for another moment, then smiled slightly and gestured toward the lodge entrance. Come then, your babies are cold, and they need to eat. We will talk more when they are settled. As Margaret followed Singing Bird into the warm interior of the lodge, she marveled at how completely her life had changed in the space of a few days. A week ago, she had been a white settler woman living in a log cabin with her husband and newborn twins, expecting to spend the winter in familiar isolation. Now, she was about to become part of a Comanche family, learning to live according to customs and traditions that were completely foreign to everything she had known. But as she settled into the warm lodge with her babies, surrounded by people who had every reason to reject her, but had instead chosen to offer her refuge, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever difficulties she might face in adapting to this new life, she knew that she and her children had been given something precious beyond measure. They had been given a chance to survive, and perhaps even to thrive, in a world where kindness could bridge any gap between strangers. Winter deepened around the Comanche camp, but inside Singing Bird's lodge, Margaret discovered a warmth that went far beyond the carefully tended fire at its center. The buffalo hide walls breathed with the rhythm of the wind outside, and the interior space was arranged with a efficiency that spoke of generations of nomadic wisdom. Singing Bird proved to be a patient teacher, showing Margaret how to prepare traditional foods, how to maintain the lodge's warmth and cleanliness, and how to care for the babies using methods that had sustained Comanche children through countless harsh winters. Margaret learned to make pemmican from dried buffalo meat and berries, to weave grass into waterproof baskets, and to read the subtle signs that predicted changes in weather. The language barrier slowly dissolved as Margaret picked up Comanche words and phrases, while Singing Bird improved her English through their daily conversations. They developed a friendship that transcended cultural differences, bonding over the universal experiences of motherhood and the shared work of keeping a household running smoothly. Running Wolf's children, Little Horse and Prairie Flower, initially viewed Margaret and her babies with curious suspicion. But children adapt more quickly than adults to new situations, and within days they were helping Margaret with small tasks and teaching her simple Comanche phrases. Joseph and William, now thriving on a combination of Margaret's recovering milk supply and traditional native foods, seemed to respond to the constant presence of other children with increased alertness and contentment. The other band members gradually accepted Margaret's presence, as it became clear that she was genuinely committed to contributing, rather than merely surviving as a burden. She learned to tan buffalo hides, to sew moccasins and repair clothing, and to gather and process the various plants that provided medicine and nutrition during the long winter months. Margaret's medical knowledge, limited though it was, proved valuable to the community. Her experience with birthing her twins made her useful during the delivery of 2 babies born that winter, and her knowledge of European herbs complemented the band's traditional healing practices in unexpected ways. She began to earn respect not just as Running Wolf's protected refugee, but as a contributing member of the community in her own right. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself thinking less often about her old life and more about the rhythms of her new one. She woke each morning to the sound of Singing Bird preparing breakfast, spent her days in useful work alongside other women, and fell asleep each night to the comforting sounds of a community settling into peaceful rest. The hardest moments came when she thought about Thomas, when grief would strike her unexpectedly in the middle of some routine task. But she noticed that these episodes became less frequent and less devastating as time went on, not because she loved him less, but because she was building a new life that honored his memory while embracing the future her children needed. One evening in late February, as Margaret sat by the fire nursing William while Joseph slept in Prairie Flower's protective arms, Singing Bird began teaching her the traditional songs that Comanche mothers sang to their children. The melodies were different from anything Margaret had known, but they carried the same universal themes of love, protection, and hope for the future. As Margaret attempted to hum along with the ancient lullabies, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of home and family. These people, who had been strangers and supposed enemies just months ago, had become her family in every way that mattered. They had opened their hearts and their lives to her, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Running Wolf, she learned, was considered one of the band's finest hunters and warriors, but he was also known for his wisdom and fairness in settling disputes. The decision to rescue her had been characteristic of his nature, but it had also required him to stake his reputation on her character and her ability to adapt to their ways. As spring approached and the band began preparing for their seasonal migration to summer hunting grounds, Margaret faced a decision that would determine the rest of her life. The chief approached her one evening, speaking in the mixture of English and Comanche that had become their common language. "White woman," he said, settling beside the fire with the formal dignity that marked important conversations. "Winter is ending, and our people will soon move to follow the buffalo herds. You have kept your promise to work and learn our ways. Now you must choose what path your feet will follow." Margaret had been expecting this conversation, but she still felt her heart racing as the moment of decision arrived. The chief continued, his voice gentle but serious. "If you wish, we will help you return to the white settlements. Running Wolf will escort you safely to the nearest town, and you can rebuild your old life among your own people. Or, if you choose, you may remain with us and become truly one of our people. But this choice cannot be changed easily. Once you follow our path, you follow it completely." Margaret looked around the lodge that had become her home, at Singing Bird, who was teaching Little Horse to braid rope, at Prairie Flower, who was making faces at Joseph to make him smile, at Running Wolf, who was carving a new toy for William. These people had saved her life and given her children a future. They had asked for nothing in return except her willingness to contribute and her respect for their ways. But more than that, she had found something here that she hadn't expected to discover. a sense of belonging that went deeper than shared blood or common heritage. She had learned that family was not just about who you were born to, but about who chose to love and protect you when you needed it most. "I choose to stay," she said quietly, but with absolute certainty. "This is my home now. These are my people. My children will grow up as part of this band, learning both the strength of their father's heritage and the wisdom of their Comanche family." The chief nodded as if he had expected this answer, but his smile showed genuine pleasure at her decision. "Then you will need a new name, one that reflects who you have become rather than who you were. The women will choose this name, as is our custom, and it will be announced at the spring ceremony when we celebrate the renewal of life." 3 days later, as the band prepared to break winter camp and begin their journey to the summer grounds, the women gathered around Margaret in a circle of ancient tradition. Singing birds spoke for them all, her voice carrying the weight of formal ceremony. "You came to us as a stranger in the snow, carrying new life in your arms and death in your heart," she said. "You have shown us that courage comes in many forms, and that the bonds of family can be stronger than the accidents of birth. From this day forward, you will be known as Snow Walker, she who found her true path in the depths of winter." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as the women embraced her one by one, welcoming her officially into the community she had already come to love. Joseph and William, now healthy and strong, gurgled contentedly in her arms, unaware that they were witnessing their own transformation from orphaned white settlers into members of a Comanche band. As the camp began its migration that spring, Margaret rode beside Singing Bird's travois, her own babies secure in their traveling cradle, her new name singing in her heart. She looked back once at the place where she had spent the winter learning to be someone new, then turned her face towards the horizon where her future lay. The woman who had been dying in a frozen cabin was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more complete. Snow Walker had been born from desperation and nurtured by the kindness of strangers who had chosen to see past differences to the common humanity that connected all people. Years later, when Joseph and William had grown into young men who moved as easily through the world of their Comanche family as fish through water, Margaret would tell them the story of the blizzard that had changed everything. She would speak of their father Thomas with love and respect, ensuring they knew the heritage of courage and determination he had passed to them. But she would also tell them about Running Wolf's choice to save rather than ignore, about Singing Bird's willingness to share her lodge and her children, about a chief who had the wisdom to see beyond tribal boundaries to the human need for compassion. She would help them understand that families could be built as well as born, and that home was not a place on a map, but a feeling of belonging that came from being truly accepted and loved. The blizzard of 1847 had taken Thomas O'Sullivan's life and destroyed Margaret's old world, but it had also created something new and precious. A family forged in crisis, strengthened by daily choice, and bound together by love that transcended every difference that might have divided them. Snow Walker's story became part of the band's oral tradition, told around winter fires as an example of how the spirits sometimes use the harshest circumstances to bring people together in ways they never could have imagined. It was a story about survival, but more importantly, it was a story about the courage required to trust strangers, the wisdom needed to see past surface differences, and the love that could transform enemies into family. In a world that often seemed divided by race and culture, by fear and misunderstanding, Margaret O'Sullivan's transformation into Snow Walker stood as proof that human connections could bridge any gap, that kindness could overcome any prejudice, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships could become the strongest bonds of all. The babies she had carried into that blizzard grew up to become bridges between two worlds, carrying the best of both their heritages and helping others understand that diversity was not a source of division, but a gift that made communities stronger. They were living proof that love had no boundaries, that family had no single definition, and that sometimes the most profound journeys began with a single act of unexpected kindness in the depths of winter's fury.